In the spring of 1873, one of Virginia's most powerful plantation families, the Ashfords of Riverside Manor, simply ceased to exist. The patriarch died under mysterious circumstances. The heir was found dead in a tavern brawl at age 23. The matriarch succumbed to what doctors called nervous exhaustion, but what everyone knew was guilt-driven madness. And the property that had been in the family for 3 generations was sold at auction for a fraction of its value to settle debts. No one understood how they had accumulated. For decades, historians puzzled over the rapid collapse of the Ashford dynasty. The family had survived the Civil War relatively intact, had adapted to Reconstruction better than most Virginia plantation owners, and seemed positioned to thrive in the New South. Yet within 18 months, everything disintegrated. Court records show a trail of lawsuits, accusations, and sealed depositions. Local newspapers made vague references to irregularities and unfortunate circumstances, but provided no details. It was as if the entire community had agreed to forget something too shameful to speak aloud. The truth remained buried for over 50 years, until a collection of private letters was discovered in 1925 during the demolition of what had once been Riverside Manor's main house. Those letters, along with testimony from formerly enslaved people collected by researchers in the 1930s, finally revealed what happened. And the story that emerged was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. It began with a wedding and a desperate mother's decision, and it ended with the total destruction of everyone involved. Before we continue with this story of deception, desperation, and the devastating consequences of treating human beings as property, make sure you are subscribed. Hit that button now, and leave a comment. Watching from. These forgotten American stories need to be told, and I love knowing they were reaching people across the country. The story begins in the autumn of 1871 in Albemarle County, Virginia, on a plantation called Riverside Manor. The property stretched across 2,000 acres of fertile land along the James River, land that had made the Ashford family wealthy through tobacco cultivation for 3 generations. The main house was an imposing Greek Revival structure with white columns, wide verandas, and all the refinement expected of Virginia's planter aristocracy. The family patriarch was Colonel William Ashford, 70 years old in 1871, a man who had somehow navigated the Civil War without losing everything like so many of his neighbors. He'd been shrewd enough to hide assets, influential enough to avoid the worst of Reconstruction as penalties, and ruthless enough to adapt to the new labor system that replaced slavery. His son, Thomas Ashford, had died at Gettysburg in 1863, leaving behind a widow named Eleanor and a young son named Thomas Jr., who was 26 years old in 1871. Thomas Jr. was the family's great hope, the heir who would carry the Ashford name into the future. He was tall, well-educated, with refined manners that came from years at the University of Virginia. But there was something fragile about him, something that suggested he might shatter under too much pressure. He preferred books to business, long walks to social gatherings. He seemed perpetually uncomfortable in his own skin, as if the role of Virginia gentleman didn't quite fit. Eleanor Ashford, his mother, was 52 years old and had effectively run Riverside Manor since her husband's death. She was a woman of iron will wrapped in silken lace, capable of making brutal decisions while maintaining the appearance of genteel Southern womanhood. She understood that in Virginia in 1871, appearances mattered more than truth, and that reputation could be destroyed faster than it could be built. The marriage had been arranged between 2 families desperate to consolidate wealth and influence. Thomas Jr. was to marry Catherine Blackwell, the 19-year-old daughter of Judge Nathaniel Blackwell, whose plantation bordered Riverside Manor to the south. Catherine was considered a beauty by the standards of the time, pale and delicate with dark hair and refined manners learned at a finishing school in Richmond. But she was also terrified of marriage, specifically of the wedding night, and what it would require of her. Catherine had been raised by a deeply religious mother who had filled her head with conflicting messages about purity, submission, and the mysterious duties of a wife. She understood marriage was expected of her, but the physical reality of it filled her with dread that bordered on panic. In the weeks before the wedding, she confessed her fears to her mother, Mrs. Blackwell, who was equally unprepared to offer comfort or guidance beyond vague reassurances that a wife must submit to her husband, and it will not be as terrible as you imagine. But as the wedding date approached, Catherine's fear intensified into something closer to terror. She stopped eating properly. She developed tremors. She would wake in the night screaming from nightmares she couldn't remember. Her mother, frightened by the intensity of Catherine's distress, sought advice from Eleanor Ashford 3 days before the ceremony. The two women met in Eleanor's private sitting room, speaking in hushed voices while servants moved discreetly in distant parts of the house. Mrs. Blackwell explained the situation with growing desperation. Catherine was on the verge of collapse. She was begging to delay the wedding, to call it off entirely. But both families had invested too much in this union. Contracts had been signed. Announcements had been made. Guests had been invited from across Virginia. There was no backing out without scandal that would destroy both families' reputations. Eleanor Ashford listened carefully, her sharp mind already working through possibilities. She was a woman who had survived the war, Reconstruction, and widowhood by being pragmatic and occasionally ruthless. She saw solutions where others saw only problems, and after a long silence, she proposed something that made Mrs. Blackwell's face go pale. "What if," Eleanor said slowly, "Catherine didn't have to endure the wedding night? Not immediately, at least. What if we gave her time to adjust to marriage gradually, while still preserving the appearance of consummation?" Mrs. Blackwell stared at her. "I don't understand what you are suggesting." Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. "The wedding night will take place in darkness, as is proper. Thomas will have been celebrating with the other men, drinking champagne and whiskey as tradition demands. In that darkness, after all those drinks, would he truly know the difference? Would he be certain of who was in his bed?" The implications hung in the air between them. Mrs. Blackwell's hands trembled. "You were suggesting we substitute someone else. But who? And how?" "I have someone in mind," Eleanor said. "A house servant, young, intelligent, with features not entirely dissimilar to Catherine's. Someone who understands the importance of absolute silence. Someone who has no choice in the matter." The woman Eleanor had in mind was named Sarah, an enslaved woman who was technically no longer enslaved due to the 13th Amendment, but who remained bound to Riverside Manor by the brutal economics of sharecropping and the reality that freedom without resources was just another kind of prison. Sarah was 22 years old, had been born on the plantation, and had spent her entire life learning to be invisible, to serve without question, to survive by understanding exactly what the white family needed before they asked for it. Sarah had been Eleanor's personal maid since childhood, had nursed Thomas Jr. when his own wet nurse fell ill, had learned to read by listening to Thomas's lessons with his tutor. She was intelligent, perceptive, and had long ago accepted that her body, like her labor, belonged to people who would never see her as fully human. The plan that Eleanor and Mrs. Blackwell devised was simple in concept, but horrifying in execution. On the wedding night, after the ceremony and celebration, Catherine would be taken to her room by her mother, where she would change into her nightgown and then hide in an adjoining chamber. Sarah would be brought in through a back entrance, dressed in identical nightclothes, and placed in the darkened marriage bed. Thomas, drunk and exhausted from celebrating, would consummate the marriage in complete darkness, never knowing he was with the wrong woman. By morning, Sarah would be removed before dawn, and Catherine would be placed in the bed, where she would pretend to have slept through the night. The marriage would be technically consummated, appearances would be preserved, and Catherine would have time to gradually accept her wifely duties. It was monstrous. It was a violation of everyone involved. But Eleanor and Mrs. Blackwell, desperate and trained by their culture to see enslaved people as tools rather than humans, convinced themselves it was a reasonable solution to a difficult problem. The wedding took place on October 15, 1871, a crisp autumn day with brilliant blue sky and leaves turning gold and red across the Virginia countryside. The ceremony was held in the chapel at Riverside Manor, built by Thomas S. great-grandfather in 1810. The building was filled with members of Virginia's planter class, all dressed in their finest, all pretending that the war hadn't nearly destroyed everything they'd once taken for granted. Thomas Jr. stood at the altar in a black suit, looking pale and distant. Catherine arrived in a white lace dress imported from France, her face hidden behind a veil, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her bouquet. The minister, Reverend James Morrison, performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity, speaking of duty, submission, and the sanctity of marriage bonds. When it came time for Thomas to kiss his bride, he lifted the veil and pressed his lips briefly to Catherine's trembling mouth. Those close enough noticed she was crying. The reception that followed was elaborate, held in the gardens and main house of Riverside Manor. Tables were laden with food, roasted meats, elaborate pastries, fruits imported from further south. Wine and champagne flowed freely. A small orchestra played waltzes. The guests danced and gossiped and pretended everything was normal, that the world hadn't fundamentally changed, that their way of life would continue forever. Thomas drank heavily, urged on by male guests who found his nervousness amusing and who had their own memories of wedding night anxieties. By evening, he was unsteady on his feet, his words slightly slurred, his inhibitions lowered. Catherine sat at the head table, barely touching her food, her face growing paler with each passing hour. As the sun set and guests began to depart, the moment everyone had been anticipating drew closer. Sarah spent that day working in the kitchens, helping prepare and serve the elaborate feast. She moved through the crowds of white guests with practiced invisibility, carrying trays, refilling glasses, her face carefully blank. But inside she was terrified. Eleanor had told her that morning what would be required of her that night. Sarah had tried to protest, to refuse, but Eleanor's voice had been ice cold. "You will do this, Sarah. You will do exactly as I instruct, and you will never speak of it to anyone. Ever. Do you understand?" What choice did Sarah have? She was trapped by economics, by law, by the entire structure of a society that had only recently and reluctantly acknowledged she was human. She nodded, accepting her fate with the same resignation she'd learned to apply to every other violation and indignity of her life. As midnight approached, and the last guests departed, the plan was set in motion. Mrs. Blackwell took Catherine upstairs to the bridal chamber, a large room on the second floor that had been specially prepared with fresh linens, candles, and flowers. She helped Catherine into a white cotton nightgown, then quietly led her to a small adjoining dressing room where she would wait until morning. Catherine went without protest, relief visible on her face. Meanwhile, in a back hallway, Eleanor brought Sarah to a service entrance. She had Sarah wash thoroughly, perfume her hair, and change into an identical white nightgown. Then she led Sarah up the servants' stairs to the bridal chamber, now darkened except for a single candle burning low by the bed. Eleanor positioned Sarah in the bed, pulled the covers up to her chin, and gave her final instructions in a harsh whisper. "You will not speak. You will not make any sound. You will let him do what he needs to do quickly. When it's over, you will lie still until I come for you before dawn. Do you understand?" Sarah, lying in the darkness, felt tears sliding down her face, but she nodded. Eleanor extinguished the remaining candle and left, closing the door behind her. The room fell into complete darkness. Downstairs, Thomas's male friends were giving him final advice and encouragement, making crude jokes that made him laugh uncomfortably. He climbed the stairs to the second floor with unsteady steps, his heart pounding, his mind foggy with alcohol. He entered the bridal chamber, fumbling in the darkness. He could make out a shape in the bed, could hear quiet breathing. His new wife waiting for him. What happened in that room over the next hour, no one recorded in detail. Sarah endured it in silence, as she'd been ordered. Thomas, drunk and nervous and in complete darkness, believed he was with Catherine. When it was over, he collapsed into sleep almost immediately. Sarah lay awake in the darkness, tears streaming silently down her face, waiting for Eleanor to come rescue her from this nightmare. Before dawn, just as the first gray light began to appear in the windows, Eleanor slipped into the room. Thomas was snoring, dead to the world. She quietly extracted Sarah from the bed, wrapped a robe around her, and led her down the servants' stairs. Then she returned with Catherine, carefully placed her in the bed beside her sleeping husband, arranged her hair on the pillow, and slipped away. When Thomas woke hours later with a pounding headache, Catherine was beside him, apparently asleep. The bed showed evidence of consummation. Everything appeared as it should. The deception was complete. Or so Eleanor believed. The days following the wedding settled into an uncomfortable routine. Catherine and Thomas lived as strangers sharing a house, barely speaking, sleeping in the same bed but never touching after that first night. Catherine, relieved to have escaped the feared consummation, began to relax slightly. Thomas, confused by his wife's coldness and his own fragmented memories of the wedding night, withdrew into books and solitary walks. Eleanor watched them both with growing unease, wondering if her solution had merely delayed rather than solved the problem. Sarah returned to her duties as if nothing had happened, serving breakfast, cleaning rooms, moving through the house like a ghost. But something had changed in her. The other servants noticed it. She was quieter than before, more withdrawn. She would sometimes stop in the middle of a task and stare into space, her face blank but her eyes holding something terrible. Then, in November, about 5 weeks after the wedding, Sarah began experiencing morning sickness. At first, she tried to hide it, running to be sick in private, forcing herself to eat even when her stomach rebelled. But the symptoms grew worse, and eventually, one of the older servants, a woman named Ruth who had helped deliver babies on the plantation for decades, pulled Sarah aside and asked the question Sarah had been dreading. "Child, are you carrying?" Sarah broke down and told Ruth everything. The wedding night, the substitution, the violation she'd endured. Ruth listened in growing horror, then anger, then a kind of weary resignation that came from having seen too many such horrors over too many years. "You need to tell Mistress Eleanor," Ruth said finally. "This can't be hidden. The child will show. And then what?" Sarah was terrified to face Eleanor, but Ruth was right. She couldn't hide a pregnancy indefinitely. 2 days later, she asked to speak with Eleanor privately. In Eleanor's sitting room, with shaking hands and halting words, Sarah confessed that she was pregnant. From the wedding night. From Thomas, Eleanor's face went through several expressions: shock, horror, calculation, and finally cold determination. This was a catastrophe that threatened everything. If anyone discovered the truth, both families would be destroyed by scandal. The marriage could be annulled. Thomas could be publicly humiliated. The carefully constructed lie would unravel spectacularly. Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities. She could force Sarah to take herbs that would end the pregnancy, though such things were dangerous and illegal. She could send Sarah away, sell her off to someone far from Virginia, though that would raise questions. She could do nothing and hope the pregnancy somehow wasn't Thomas's, though the timing made that impossible. While Eleanor struggled with this new complication, another crisis emerged. Catherine announced, timidly but clearly, that she believed she was pregnant. She'd missed her monthly cycle, had been feeling ill in the mornings, and thought perhaps the wedding night had resulted in conception after all. The news should have been cause for celebration. An heir for the Ashford line. Except Eleanor knew with terrible certainty that Catherine had never actually consummated the marriage. Her pregnancy was impossible, which meant Catherine had been with someone else. Eleanor confronted Catherine in private, and after much crying and denial, the truth emerged. About 2 weeks after the wedding, confused and guilty about the deception, Catherine had sought comfort from her cousin James Blackwell, a young officer stationed nearby. In a moment of weakness and emotional turmoil, they'd been together once, just once, and now Catherine was carrying James's child, though everyone would believe it was Thomas's. Eleanor felt the world spinning around her. 2 pregnancies, neither from the marriage, both threatening to expose catastrophic lies. She had tried to solve one problem and had instead created a nightmare from which there was no escape. Over the following months, Eleanor made increasingly desperate decisions. She kept Sarah isolated, claiming she was ill with something contagious. She supported Catherine's pregnancy publicly while privately raging at the girl's foolishness. She watched Thomas grow more withdrawn and confused, sensing something was wrong but unable to identify what, and she waited for the inevitable moment when everything would collapse. Sarah gave birth in April 1872, attended only by Ruth in a remote cabin on the plantation's edge. The baby was a boy, healthy and strong, with features that might have resembled Thomas or might have been Sarah's own. Eleanor took the infant within hours of his birth, and Sarah never saw him again. What happened to that child was never recorded. Some said he was given to a family of freedmen in another county. Others whispered darker possibilities. Catherine gave birth 2 weeks later in the main house, attended by a physician from Richmond and surrounded by family celebrating the arrival of the Ashford heir. The baby was a boy they named William Thomas Ashford, though his real father was James Blackwell. The child appeared healthy and normal, with no obvious signs of his mixed paternity. Eleanor held him and felt only dread. The years that followed were marked by slow-motion disintegration. Thomas began to suspect something was wrong with his marriage, though he couldn't identify what. He noticed Catherine's guilt, her inability to look him in the eye, her desperate sadness. He noticed his mother's constant tension, her sharp responses, her increasing isolation. He started drinking more heavily, spending more time away from the house. Catherine descended into severe depression that 19th century doctors couldn't treat effectively. She stopped eating properly, stopped caring for young William, spent hours staring out windows at nothing. She would sometimes weep inconsolably, calling out apologies to people who weren't there. The family physician prescribed laudanum, a tincture of opium that provided temporary relief but created dependence. Sarah remained on the plantation, a living reminder of Eleanor's terrible decision. She was broken in ways that went beyond the physical, operating mechanically through her days, responding when spoken to but showing no emotion, no life. The other servants whispered that she'd been cursed, that something evil had touched her and stolen her soul. Then, in the summer of 1872, the truth began to emerge. A relative who'd been at the wedding mentioned to someone that Catherine had looked terrified that night, that she'd barely been able to walk down the aisle. That person mentioned to another how strange it was that she'd become pregnant so quickly given how frightened she'd been. Questions began to multiply. Servants who'd been present the night of the wedding started talking among themselves, comparing observations, noticing inconsistencies. By autumn, rumors were spreading through Albemarle County. Nothing specific, just whispers that something wasn't right with the Ashford marriage, that young William might not actually be the heir everyone believed he was. Other plantation families began maintaining distance, Business partners became cautious. Social invitations stopped arriving. Thomas, desperate to understand what was destroying his life, confronted his mother. After hours of denial, Eleanor finally broke down and confessed the substitution on the wedding night. She told him about Sarah, about how it was supposed to solve Catherine's fears, about how it had all gone so terribly wrong. Thomas's face went white. He stared at his mother as if seeing a stranger. "You use Sarah like that?" His voice was barely a whisper. "And you thought that would fix anything?" Then he demanded the truth about Catherine's pregnancy. Eleanor, already broken by confession, told him everything. That Catherine had never actually been with him that night, that she'd been with her cousin James, that William wasn't his son, that everything Thomas thought he knew about his marriage and his family was a lie. Thomas walked out of that conversation and didn't come back. He took a room at an inn in Charlottesville and spent the next 3 days drinking. When he finally returned to Riverside Manor, he was a changed man, hollow-eyed and broken. He confronted Catherine, and she confirmed everything through tears and desperate apologies. He told her he wanted an annulment. She begged him to reconsider, for William's sake if not for hers, but Thomas was beyond caring. The scandal broke into the open in early 1873, when Thomas filed papers for annulment in Richmond. The grounds were fraud and non-consummation. When the details became public, Virginia society reacted with horror and fascination. Newspapers published veiled accounts. Families that had known the Ashfords for generations cut all contact. The Blackwells became pariahs. Judge Blackwell lost his position. James Blackwell, Catherine's cousin, fled Virginia entirely. The legal battles were vicious and public. Depositions were taken, testimony given, secrets exposed. The use of Sarah on the wedding night came out in court, adding another layer of horror to the scandal. Clergy denounced the Ashfords from pulpits. Former friends wrote cutting letters. The family's social standing disintegrated completely. Colonel William Ashford, the family patriarch who had survived so much, died in March 1873, officially of heart failure, but everyone knew it was shame and stress that killed him. Thomas descended further into alcoholism and died in May, found dead in a tavern brawl in Richmond at age 28. Catherine, already heavily dependent on laudanum, overdosed in June. Whether accidentally or intentionally was never determined. Young William, only a year old, was taken in by distant relatives who raised him under a different name. Eleanor Ashford lived longest, surviving until October 1873. She spent her final months in near-total isolation, maintaining what remained of Riverside Manor with a skeleton staff, speaking to almost no one. The servants who remained reported that she would sometimes be heard talking to herself, having arguments with people who weren't there, defending decisions no one was asking about anymore. When she died, the doctor wrote exhaustion and nervous collapse on the death certificate, but everyone knew she'd been eaten alive by guilt. The property went to auction in November 1873. It sold for a fraction of its value to settle debts that had accumulated during the legal battles and the family's collapse. The main house stood empty for several years, gradually falling into disrepair. Various owners tried to make something of the land, but none succeeded for long. There were stories about the place being cursed, about strange sounds at night, about rooms that never felt warm no matter how large the fire. And Sarah, after emancipation truly took effect, and she was able to leave Riverside Manor, Sarah moved to Richmond. She worked in various domestic positions, saved money carefully, and eventually opened a small boarding house for freedmen. She married a carpenter named Isaiah Freeman in 1878, and had 3 children who survived to adulthood. She never spoke publicly about what had happened to her at Riverside Manor, But her children later said she would sometimes wake screaming from nightmares she never described. The most remarkable part of Sarah's story came years later. Through careful saving and shrewd investments in Richmond real estate, Sarah accumulated modest wealth. In 1891, when the Riverside Manor property came up for sale, yet again after its latest owner went bankrupt, Sarah purchased it at auction. She was 42 years old and had become a property owner of the very plantation where she'd been enslaved and violated. Sarah didn't move back to Riverside Manor. Instead, she divided the land into small parcels and sold them to freedmen families at prices they could afford, creating a community of black property owners on land that had once been worked by slaves. She had the main house torn down, its materials used to build a school and a church for the community. The slave quarters were demolished in a ceremony that drew hundreds of people, and in their place, Sarah planted a garden of fruit trees. Sarah Freeman lived until 1915, dying at age 66. Her funeral was attended by more than 300 people, including descendants of families who had been enslaved at Riverside Manor, and families who had built new lives on land she'd helped them acquire. Local newspapers published obituaries noting her business acumen and community leadership, though they omitted or glossed over the earlier trauma that had shaped her life. The Ashford family line effectively ended with the scandal of 1872. Young William, raised under a different name by relatives, never had children. The family name disappeared from Virginia society. Their former property became something entirely different. A community built by people the Ashfords had once owned, thriving on land the family had destroyed themselves trying to protect. The story of what happened at Riverside Manor in 1871 was largely suppressed for decades, emerging only gradually through scattered letters, court documents, and oral histories. It remains one of the most complete examples of how the dehumanization inherent in slavery corrupted everyone it touched, destroying enslaver and enslaved alike, even after slavery as legal end. The substitution on the wedding night was meant to solve a problem while preserving appearances. Instead, it became the first thread in an unraveling that destroyed two families completely. Eleanor Ashford made a monstrous decision that she believed was pragmatic, treating Sarah as a tool rather than a human being. And that decision, like a poison, spread through everything it touched, killing everyone involved either literally or socially. Sarah survived and eventually thrived, but the cost was enormous. She carried trauma that never fully healed, endured violations that no amount of later success could undo. Her triumph in eventually owning and transforming Riverside Manor was real, but it couldn't erase what had been done to her there. This is the story they tried to bury. The story of how one desperate decision, one night of deception, one act of treating a human being as disposable property, destroyed absolutely everything. And perhaps that's the real lesson here, that no amount of protecting reputation, no amount of maintaining appearances, no amount of pragmatic calculation can overcome the fundamental immorality of treating human beings as less than human. The Ashfords thought they could control everything, manage every problem, maintain their position through clever manipulation. Instead, they destroyed themselves completely, and in the ruins of their destruction, the woman they'd used and discarded rebuilt something better. Today, there's a historical marker near where Riverside Manor once stood. It commemorates the Freeman community, a settlement of black property owners established in the 1890s, on land once worked by enslaved people. The marker mentions Sarah Freeman as the community's founder, noting her work to help freedmen acquire land and build independent lives. It doesn't mention the Ashfords at all. Their name, their legacy, their carefully protected reputation, all of it is gone, erased as if it never existed. Because in the end, that's what happens when you build an empire on lies and the dehumanization of others. It doesn't last. It can't last. Eventually, the truth emerges, and everything collapses. And the people you tried to erase become the ones remembered.